If you look at a map of modern ethnic conflicts, I mean, the borders look ancient.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, they really do look like tectonic plates that have just been grinding against each other for millennia, just waiting for the pressure to snap.
Yeah, we see these stark, color-coded lines on the news separating different cultural groups, and we just assume
That they've been in a blood feud since the dawn of time.
Right. Exactly. It's an instinctive reaction.
But what if I told you that one of the deepest, bloodiest ethnic divides in South Asia was essentially invented by a 19th century British tourist who thought, like, a local shepherd looked a little bit too Irish?
It's wild. It completely dismantles the way we're taught to consume global news.
It really does.
Because, we're handed this packaged narrative of ancient tribal hatreds, which is a very convenient phrase.
Oh, super convenient.
Right, because it stops us from asking the structural questions.
Right.
It stops us from asking, well, who physically drew those lines? What were their biases? And what bureaucratic machinery locked those biases into place?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the mission of our deep dive today is to explore a body of historical text that fundamentally rewrite the history of regional conflict.
It really is a paradigm shift.
Yeah. So we're looking at sources that trace the origin of the Pashtun and Punjabi divide alongside the modern erosion of the Saraiki political identity. And these documents, they prove that these intense cultural rifts did not bubble up from some ancient bedrock.
No, not at all.
They were the highly traceable, completely unintended consequences of early 19th century map-making, deeply flawed travel diaries, and just the sheer laziness of colonial administration.
Which is such a crazy concept, right? We're going to look at how empires literally manufactured modern ethnic divides completely by accident.
So where's the starting line for a story this massive? Because we have to go pretty far back.
Well, the only way to really understand how a massive cultural divide is built is to look at the region before the divide existed.
Right.
We need a clean historical baseline. And our sources provide this really remarkable one in the year 1808. Yeah, we're looking through the eyes of a British envoy named Mountstuart Elphinstone.
Mountstuart Elphinstone. Sounds very 19th century British.
Oh, it's as British as it gets. So he was leading this major diplomatic mission, traveling out from Delhi and moving through the corridor that connects Hindustan to the Afghan frontier.
Okay, I want to make sure we have the geography and the timeline locked in for anyone listening.
Yeah.
We're talking about 1808, which is decades before the massive military conquest that would eventually reshape this entire region.
Exactly.
So Elphinstone is walking into a relatively untouched sociopolitical landscape.
Untouched by European administration, certainly. I mean, Elphinstone and his diplomatic team were among the very first outside observers to systematically document this specific frontier.
And this is before the Sikh Empire.
Yes, before the Sikh Empire and later the British Empire just completely scrambled the political geography. And when you dive into Elphinstone's massive, highly detailed diaries, a very specific detail jumps out regarding his use of the word Punjab.
Yeah, the text notes that he uses it purely as a geographic placeholder, right? Like, there's no baggage attached to it whatsoever.
None. Zero. Throughout his entire account, Punjab is deployed strictly to describe the physical plain located between the Indus tributaries.
Just the land.
Right. It meant nothing more than the dirt, the rivers, and the coordinates on a map. Today, that word in this specific regional context can carry a very heavy, sometimes really negative political charge.
Oh, totally.
But in 1808, it wasn't a slur. It wasn't a marker of an occupying outsider. It was used in the exact same neutral, descriptive way that they use terms like Kashmir or Daman.
It's the equivalent of saying the Midwest or the Rockies.
Exactly.
You're just orienting someone in space.
Yeah.
There's no inherent malice in a geographical designation. But that raises an immediate question about the people living there. You know, if they weren't defining themselves through these hostile, rigid labels like Punjabi versus Pashtun, how did the people in... Because we love our boxes.
We do. But identity in this era was not a fixed biological marker. It wasn't stamped on your birth certificate and chained to you for life. Right, exactly. The Sarozai were a prominent lineage within the Afghan Durrani Empire, which, exerted influence over vast territories, including Multan.
Got it.
So you have this ethnically Afghan governor installed in this key trading and administrative hub. But Elphinstone observed something totally fascinating about this.
That concept totally shatters the way we think about ethnic purity today.
It really does.
It implies that identity is porous. I mean, if you take a modern example, and just naturally acclimate to the local culture, It's an organic blend.
Yeah, you don't build a fortress in your backyard and declare yourself a sovereign citizen of Massachusetts for the rest of eternity.
Exactly. The environment softens the differences. But, I mean, human nature being what it is, people always find ways to differentiate themselves from... Well, what's fascinating here is that the sources are not claiming the region was a monolith at all, or that people didn't notice differences.
Yeah.
Actually, Elphinstone was incredibly obsessive about
variation. He wrote that the inhabitants of the Bahawalpur tract were strong, dark, harsh-featured.
Okay, so he's definitely categorizing them.
Oh, heavily. He pointed...
Categorization was happening, but it sounds like it lacked a military edge, like it wasn't a threat.
Exactly. The key phrase in the text is graduated cultural differences.
Graduated like a...
But they were observed as a continuum.
Gotcha.
They were not hostile, militarized, dividing lines. The antagonism simply wasn't there yet. In 1808, identity was...
So we've established our pristine 1808 baseline. Borders are fluid. The word Punjab is just a spot on a map, and ethnic differences are treated as because something clearly breaks.
Yeah. The engine for that transformation was the colonial gaze. Long before any armies marched in to draw physical borders, the conceptual borders were drawn a type of 19th century European racial baggage to the frontier.
They couldn't just observe the gradient. They had to carve it up.
They had to categorize it. And they did so based almost entirely on a textbook for how the British Empire viewed this part of the world.
The ultimate travel guide for imperialists.
Exactly. And in that book, and the writings of those who followed him,
opposed to categorizing human beings by the melanin in their skin.
It is. It really is.
It's like watching a Victorian butterfly collector walk into a complex, thriving ecosystem.
Elphinstone and his contemporaries, lighter skin was subconsciously, or honestly sometimes consciously linked to a closer proximity to Europeans.
Right, because of course it was.
The emerging racial hierarchy operated in real time.
The Karoti camp. We have to dig into this story because it perfectly captures the malfunction in the colonial brain.
So Elphinstone rides out to visit and he cannot accept them as a single group.
He literally can't process it.
No. He immediately starts visually sorting the crowd face by face. He writes in his diary that the children are mostly fair.
Sorting within a single tribe. How does that even make sense if they're all from the exact same community? He is literally standing inside a single tribal camp looking at people who are... A 19th century British aristocrat looks at an Afghan shepherd thousands of miles from Europe and his brain immediately conjures up an Irish farmhand.
Yeah. He's sorting them into tiers, like ordinary versus startling, native versus almost European.
But here is the critical question. If a guy writes a bizarre racially charged diary entry, mechanism that takes this weird colonial categorization and turns it into a geopolitical weapon.
The mechanism is the British imperial bureaucracy. You have to remember that books like Elphinstone's didn't just sit on a dusty shelf in London.
They were read by the people in charge.
They became required reading for the War Office and the colonial administration. Over the following decades, skin color and these arbitrary aesthetics-based categories became official shorthand for a cluster of assumed behavioral traits.
Wow.
This is the origin of the martial racist theory.
So they took the travel diaries and just used them as a psychological profile for recruitment.
They institutionalized it. By the mid-19th, distinguishing between what he called pure tribes, like the Marwats, and mixed populations in places like Benue. And the metric for this was deeply tied to the physical, martial, aggressive, and highly reliable for military service.
And the darker groups.
Conversely, the darker, supposedly mixed groups were deemed soft, agricultural, and completely unsuitable for military recruitment.
That is a staggering leap of logic. They built an entire military apparatus, deciding who gets a gun, who gets a salary, who gets state backing, based on a tourist's aesthetic preference from 1808.
It's terrifying when you really think about it.
They're artificially empowering one group over another based on nothing but proximity to a European physical ideal. But the sources are clear that while this ethnographic sorting was deeply damaging, it wasn't enough on its own to create the visceral political hatred we see later. Travel writers can invent the categories, but they can't invent the trauma.
No, they can't.
Something else had to happen to...
Seated hostility, we have to examine the Sikh interval.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this period completely flips the historical script of the entire region. We're talking about a reversal of a millennia-old pattern.
We are. We're looking at the period roughly between 1802 and 1849, driven by Maharaja Ranjit Singh, the founder of the Sikh Empire.
Okay, Set the scene for us.
So Ranjit Singh launched this massive, aggressive expansion of the Khalsa state into the Trans-Indus and Derajat tracts. To really grasp the psychological earthquake this caused, you need the historical context of the preceding 1,000 years.
Right, because context is everything here.
For a millennium, power, invasion, and military conquest had almost universally flowed from the west to the east.
The Afghans and Pashtuns had traditionally been the conquerors.
Yes, sweeping down from the mountains and asserting dominance over the plains of the Punjab.
The power dynamic was entirely one-directional. If you lived in the Punjab, you expected the threat to come from the west. If you lived in the Afghan frontier, you were used to being the origin point of authority. You were the ones in charge.
Ranjit Singh shattered that dynamic.
Completely flipped it.
For the first time in 1,000 years, the Pashtun and Afghan territories were being invaded, subjugated, and ruled by a centralized empire based in the east, specifically governed from Lahore.
And this was not a gentle diplomatic transfer of sovereignty.
Not at all. The sources zoom in on the subjugation of Multan to demonstrate the sheer brutality of this shift. Multan was fiercely contested for over a decade and a half.
How did that play out?
The armies of Lahore would invade, besiege the city, demand a massive ransom and tribute to lift the siege, and then retreat. This extortion happened repeatedly in 1802, 1805, 1807, and 1810.
It's basically a protection racket scaled up to an imperial level.
And like all rackets, eventually the violence escalates.
I did boy over.
In 1818, the Sikh armies returned, and this time they weren't there for tribute. They were there for total capitulation. They subjected Multan to months of devastating bombardment.
Just leveled it.
They breached the city walls, slaughtered the Sadozai governor and his sons, and initiated a wholesale sack of the city. Houses were burned to the ground, generations of accumulated wealth were confiscated and sent back to Lahore, and the civilian casualties were just astronomical.
Let's pause on the mechanics of that conquest, because I have a structural question here.
Sure.
If you look at the composition of Ranjit Singh's army, it was incredibly diverse. The sources are explicit that his military forces, his commanders, and his cabinet ministers were a mix of Sikhs, Muslims, and Hindus.
Very true.
So, if an army full of diverse religious communities is invading a predominantly Muslim city like Multan, why doesn't this become a holy war? Why doesn't it fracture along religious lines? How does a multi-religious army forge a singular ethnic hostility?
This raises an important question about how common people experience empire.
Right.
The lived reality for the people on the ground, the farmers, the merchants, the local elites, wasn't about the theological debates of the soldiers occupying their streets.
You didn't care about the religion of the guy with the sword.
Exactly. It was about the cold, hard mechanics of extraction. It always comes down to taxation.
The taxman doesn't care what temple or mosque you go to as long as you pay.
Precisely the point. The ultimate destination of the wealth dictated the resentment.
So where was the money going?
Lahore. Even when Multan was eventually granted a relatively fair, highly effective administrator, a man named Dewan Sawan Mal, who governed for 2 decades, lowered agricultural taxes, and genuinely helped the city recover from the sack, the structural reality was inescapable.
Because he was still an outsider.
Right. He was an outsider appointed by Lahore. The surplus wealth he extracted from Multan's recovery was being continuously funneled eastward to fund the Khalsa state's ongoing wars in other territories.
So it really doesn't matter how polite the administrator is. If the wealth of your city is being sucked out to pay for an empire centered in the east, you're going to despise the east.
And this is the exact moment the linguistic shift happens.
The mutation of the word.
Yes, a geographic demonym that used to just mean someone from the neighboring plain. The word Punjabi mutated. It became synonymous with the conqueror, the extractor, and the occupying soldier.
So it went from a direction on a map to a curse word.
Pretty much. Punjabi was no longer a neutral label. It was the geographic identity of the people who bombarded your city, killed your governor, and now took your taxes.
That tracks perfectly. The sheer trauma of the conquest and the economic extraction forged this new, heavily charged meaning. But logically, when you study the rise and fall of empires, you assume that when a new empire rolls into town and overthrows the old one, the political dynamic resets.
You'd think so.
Right. In 1849, the British Empire formally conquers the Punjab. They totally dismantle the Sikh Empire.
Yep, they take over entirely.
So from the perspective of someone living in Peshawar or Multan, the rulers in Lahore are suddenly out of a job. The new ultimate rulers are sitting thousands of miles away in London, or regionally in Calcutta.
Right.
You would assume the local populations would view this as a massive break from the past, like a chance to reset the oppressive dynamic. But the sources indicate the exact opposite happened.
Instead of dismantling the oppressive structure, the British essentially poured bureaucratic concrete over it.
Just locked it in.
The British conquest did not interrupt the association between the term Punjab and oppressive power. It permanently consolidated it. And they achieved this through the sheer force of administrative continuity.
Because bureaucracy is undefeated.
Exactly. When the British took over, they were looking for the cheapest, most efficient way to run their new territories. They looked at the massive provincial boundaries drawn by the Sikh Empire, and instead of redrawing them to reflect local cultural realities, they just kept them perfectly intact.
They inherited the machinery and just kept it running.
The Derajat, Peshawar, and the various frontier tracts remained tethered to a massive, sprawling administrative unit that the British continued to call the Punjab province.
And let me guess where it was governed from.
Crucially, it continued to be governed and administered from Lahore.
It's the ultimate hostile corporate buyout. Imagine a massive, monopolistic, deeply hated company gets bought out by a new global conglomerate.
Okay.
The employees on the ground might initially celebrate, thinking, finally, the old bosses are gone, things are going to change.
And then the memo comes out.
Right. The new global CEO sends out a memo saying, we are keeping the exact same middle management team in place, the regional headquarters will remain in the exact same building, and we are using the exact same reporting structure. To the people on the factory floor, nothing has changed except the logo on the letterhead. The mechanics of the oppression feel exactly the same.
That is an incredibly accurate way to visualize the administrative reality of 1849. But the British didn't just maintain the paperwork, they heavily intensified the physical, militarized occupation.
They built actual bases.
Huge ones. They established massive military cantonments, which are essentially sprawling permanent military bases in key frontier cities like Kohat and Peshawar.
And I'm guessing they weren't exactly culturally sensitive about where they put them.
Not even a little bit. The symbolism of this new occupation was incredibly blunt. The sources point out that the Peshawar cantonment, established in 1868, was literally built directly on top of old town sites and ancient graveyards.
You are literally paving over the history and the dead of the people you are supposed to be governing. It is a physical manifestation of erasure.
It's brutal.
But who was actually manning these massive forts? If the British are in charge, are these British soldiers walking the streets?
That is the most critical piece of the puzzle regarding the lived experience of the locals. The British garrisoned these massive installations with soldiers who were overwhelmingly and disproportionately recruited from the Punjab plains.
So they used Punjabi troops to garrison the Pashtun frontier?
Yes. By 1882, the garrison station at Kohat alone consisted of nearly 3,000 troops.
So if I am a local farmer, the ultimate ruler might be Queen Victoria sitting on a throne in London. But the guy holding the rifle on my street corner, the guy enforcing the tax laws, the guy I have to interact with every single day, he still has a Punjabi face.
Exactly the point the sources make. We have to center that daily lived experience.
What people actually feel.
If you were a Pashtun cultivator going to the revenue office to dispute a land claim, or facing a judge in a local court, or dealing with a recruiting sergeant, the immediate face of state power was institutionally and ethnically tied to the Punjab.
The British layered a modern, uniformed, barracked occupation directly onto the fresh, bleeding memory of the Sikh conquest.
They really did. The ultimate flag flying over the fort changed, but the structural origin of the power and the face of the enforcer did not. And we must be clear, this was not a peaceful, quiet coexistence.
Right, people fought back.
The tension was active, daily, and frequently violent. The sources document local uprisings and raids directly targeting the Kohat cantonment in 1920 and 1923. It was a constant, simmering reality of occupation.
So to summarize the sheer compounding tragedy of this, we start with travel writers inventing arbitrary racial categories based on skin color.
Check.
Then the Sikh Empire turns a geographic label into a symbol of violent conquest and extraction.
Yep.
Finally, the British Empire locks all of that trauma into place by using the exact same borders and the exact same people to enforce their new rule. It is a perfect storm of historical accidents, military violence, and bureaucratic laziness.
It really is a perfect storm.
This provides a crystal-clear roadmap for the origins of the Pashtun-Punjabi antagonism. But the sources don't stop there.
No, they don't.
They pivot to a second, parallel story that is happening at the exact same time to a region that went through the exact same empires but experienced a completely different fate. What happened to the south? What happened to the Saraiki region? Because they didn't develop this deeply militarized rivalry. Instead, their entire identity was subjected to an administrative eclipse.
This comparison is where the historical analysis becomes incredibly illuminating. The Saraiki region, which encompasses cities like Multan, Derajat Khan, and Bahawalpur, went through the identical two-stage process of conquest.
So they got hit by the Sikh Empire and then the British.
Exactly. First, they were violently absorbed by the Sikh Empire, and then they were kept in that exact same administrative box by the British.
But before that, they were their own thing, right? Like we talked about with Elphinstone's 1808 trip.
Yes. Before this dual conquest, as we established with that 1808 baseline, this region possessed its own deeply distinct political and cultural history. Multan operated with its own governor, fielded its own troops, and conducted its own regional diplomacy.
But then the empires rolled in.
Right. And the conquest absorbed this distinct region into a massive administrative unit whose name, capital, and center of gravity were unambiguously tied to the Punjab.
So what does this all mean for the people living there? If they suffered the same bombardments, the same extraction, and the same bureaucratic inheritance as the Pashtun regions, why didn't they develop the same violent hostility? Why is the Saraiki story one of erasure rather than militarized rivalry?
Because the mechanism that ground them down wasn't primarily military tension. It was a slow, crushing linguistic and administrative absorption.
A slow fade instead of a sharp cut.
Yes. And the real twist in the historical record is identifying who actually carried out that erasure.
Okay, this is the part of the deep dive that legitimately upended my understanding of colonial history. Our default modern assumption is that the colonial empire is always the entity doing the erasing.
Right. That's the standard narrative.
We assume that a bunch of British bureaucrats just looked at the Saraiki language, decided it was too complicated to learn, shrugged, and filed it under a generic Punjabi label just to save time on their census paperwork.
That is the assumption, but the historical documents show the exact opposite occurred.
Wait, really?
On paper, the British colonial empire actually defended and formalized their cultural distinctiveness.
How does that work? How does the empire that built forts on graveyards suddenly become the champion of linguistic diversity?
It comes down to the obsessive, classifying nature of colonial science. Between 1903 and 1928, a British colonial linguist named George Abraham Grierson oversaw and compiled a monumental multi-decade project called the Linguistic Survey of India.
Sounds like a massive undertaking.
It was huge. And Grierson, in his exhaustive cataloging, went out of his way to deliberately classify the Western Indus Valley dialects, including what we now recognize as Saraiki, under a completely separate, distinct label.
What did he call it?
He officially named it Southern Landa.
He didn't just group it as a weird flavor of Punjabi.
No, he explicitly, structurally separated it. He argued that it was fundamentally distinct from Punjabi proper, which was the standardized language spoken around the capital of Lahore and Amritsar.
So he saw it as its own thing.
Completely. Grierson actually grouped Landa closer to Sindhi, treating it as its own distinct branch of the Indo-Aryan language family.
That is a staggering contradiction. The colonial linguistic scholarship is empirically proving and preserving their distinct cultural identity at the exact same moment the British administrative geography is wiping their political borders off the map.
A total paradox.
It is as if the science division of the empire is in a silent war with the bureaucratic division of the empire.
That's a great way to put it. The scholarly ghost of their distinct identity was preserved in the linguistic literature, locked away in university libraries and survey reports.
But the people on the ground weren't reading survey reports.
No. The actual, on-the-ground, flattening the true erasure of their identity from the public sphere came much later. It did not come from London. It came from the post-1947 post-colonial nation-building process.
So you're saying the newly independent state, the state built on liberation from colonial rule, is the entity that ultimately erased the identity that the colonizers had scientifically recognized.
Yes. In the decades immediately following independence in 1947, the new Pakistani Linguistic and Educational Administration engaged in a deliberate process to resubsume these Lananda varieties.
He just folded them back in.
They stripped away the distinct classification and rebranded them as mere regional dialects of Punjabi. They actively aligned the educational and administrative infrastructure with the standardized Lahore-based Punjabi.
So they took all of Grierson's work and just ignored it.
In doing so, they essentially took George Abraham Gerson's massive linguistic survey, threw it out the window, and reversed its findings for the sake of political convenience.
That is a profoundly dark irony. But we have to make sure we don't treat this like some dry academic debate happening in a university faculty lounge.
Oh, it was very real.
Stripping away a linguistic identity isn't just about what dictionary you use. It has immediate, devastating, real-world consequences. When you lose your linguistic classification, you lose your political representation.
And the sources detail exactly how tragic and bloody those consequences became.
Walk us through what happened after 1947.
Well, there's a brief window of hope right around 1947 when the princely state of Bahawalpur, which was a major historical center of Saraiki identity and culture, was recognized as its own province within the new nation.
So they had a seat at the table.
It offered a brief reprieve, a tangible chance for this distinct culture to have a recognized political voice. But that window slammed shut.
What happened?
By 1955, a highly controversial policy known as the one-unit scheme was implemented, which forcefully amalgamated all the distinct provinces of West Pakistan into a single, massive administrative unit.
And let me guess, entirely dominated by Lahore.
Entirely dominated by Lahore.
And when they finally realized the one-unit scheme was a disaster and tried to undo it because that policy didn't last forever, right?
Right, and that is where the tragedy peaks. In 1969, the government decided to unwind the one-unit policy. They systematically restored all the other traditional provinces to their original pre-1955 status.
So everyone gets their borders back.
Sindhis got their province back. Balochistan was recognized. But Bahawalpur was explicitly denied. They refused to restore its provincial status, absorbing it permanently into the larger Punjab province.
They just drew a line through an entire culture's political existence.
Yeah.
How did the people of Bahawalpur react to being the only ones left out in the cold?
They took to the streets. Massive, desperate protests erupted across the region, and the state response was brutal.
How bad did it get?
The resulting violence and police actions led to the deaths of approximately 50 people.
50 people?
Yes. The sources make a point to note that this specific tragedy, these 50 lives lost fighting for a province that had already existed, is routinely glossed over or entirely left out of the tidy, sanitized administrative narratives of the country's history.
That is awful.
For the people of Bahawalpur, the promised restoration never came, and the cost of demanding it was paid in blood.
And the fallout from that political erasure in 1969 isn't just a historical footnote. Our sources provide hard data showing how this plays out in the modern socioeconomic reality of the region today.
The numbers are pretty stark.
Because when you do not exist as a distinct political entity on paper, you do not get regional funding. The data shows that today's South and Southwest Punjab, the heartland of the Saraiki-speaking population, have some of the largest household sizes in the entire country.
Right.
Yet, simultaneously, they have the absolute lowest density of access to basic human necessities: clean drinking water, gas, and electricity.
The demographic disadvantage is staggering. The data indicates they have a comparatively larger, older population, meaning a higher dependency ratio, paired with significantly fewer educated youth compared to the wealthy, industrialized regions of central and north Punjab.
So it's a perfect storm of poverty.
It is a textbook, empirical example of how administrative invisibility creates inescapable systemic poverty.
And if anyone doubts that this exclusion is systemic, we just have to look at the civil service data highlighted in the sources.
This part is mind-blowing.
The civil service is the machinery of the state. It's where the power, the funding, and the decisions are actually made. The sources analyze recruitment data for the civil service over a 3-year period, from 2009 to 2011. Over that entire window, an average of only 4 or 5 Saraiki speakers were selected for the civil service.
Which is a statistical anomaly so extreme it requires context to fully grasp.
Give us the context.
According to the 1998 census data, the Saraiki ethnic group constitutes over 17.4% of the entire population of the Punjab province. And demographic experts suggest the real number is likely much higher, potentially up to 21.4% in the rural districts.
So you have a distinct linguistic community that makes up nearly a fifth of the provincial population, millions upon millions of people. And they are represented by 4 or 5 individuals in the halls of power.
Yes. It's almost mathematically impossible to do that by accident.
That isn't just underrepresentation. That is a bureaucratic quarantine. It is a vicious, closed loop. You don't exist on paper as a distinct group, so the state doesn't allocate funding for your region.
Exactly.
Because you don't get funding, you don't build schools, so you didn't get education. Because you don't have access to higher education, you cannot pass the exams to get civil service jobs. And because you have zero presence in the civil service, there is no one inside the government to fight for your recognition on paper. The loop just feeds itself forever.
It's a perfectly sealed system of exclusion.
But the question that keeps bothering me is the ideological motivation behind this. Why was the newly independent state, which was founded by a diverse coalition of Muslims from across the subcontinent, so immediately hostile to the concept of regional identity?
That question leads us to perhaps the most fascinating psychological insight contained in our sources.
What were they thinking?
The early leadership of the newly independent state operated under a profound existential paranoia. They were trying to hold together a geographically divided, ethnically diverse country, and they genuinely viewed distinctive ethnocultural identities as a literal menace to state survival.
So they were just terrified the country would fall apart.
Yes. The prevailing ideology was that a shared religious identity had to utterly override and erase all regional, linguistic, or cultural loyalties.
But the Punjabi elite, the people driving this standardization from Lahore, had a very specific, deeply personal perspective on this cultural sacrifice, didn't they?
They did, and it is crucial for understanding their mindset. In 1947, the Punjabi elite and the educated middle class of West Pakistan made a conscious, voluntary decision to sacrifice their own linguistic distinctiveness.
They gave up their own language.
They willingly abandoned standard Punjabi in the realms of education, administration, and high culture, accepting the total supremacy of Urdu for the sake of forging a unified national identity. They gave up their mother tongue in the public sphere to build the nation.
So they view themselves as the ultimate patriots.
Yeah.
They made the sacrifice.
And because they had made that profound cultural sacrifice, they possessed zero empathy or comprehension for anyone who refused to do the same.
Oh, I see where this is going.
When they looked at the Saraikis, the Pashtuns, the Sindhis, and the Balak populations who were desperately clinging to their ethno-linguistic identities, the Punjabi elite did not see people fighting for survival.
What do they see?
They saw backwardness. They viewed this attachment to regional identity as selfish, dangerous parochialism that threatened to tear the new country apart.
It's like someone voluntarily paving over their own beautiful, unique garden to build a uniform, gray, concrete driveway because the neighborhood association said it would look neater.
That's a great way to put it.
And then they look over the fence and demand their neighbors bulldoze their gardens too. Like, I gave up my flowers for the greater good. Why do you get to keep yours?
Exactly. It's a projection of their own sacrifice.
But we have to interrogate this from a structural perspective. Doesn't building a unified, functional, modern nation-state actually require a massive amount of standardization?
It's a fair question.
I mean, you need a common language for the federal courts to function, for the military to communicate, for the educational curriculum to be legible across borders. Every single modern nation, from France to the United States, has done some version of this linguistic flattening. Isn't this just the ugly, necessary reality of state building?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, you are touching on the core friction of modern statecraft. Yes, building a shared national infrastructure requires commonality, but the historical sources argue a very specific cautionary point.
Because
Unity cannot simply overwrite identity through sheer force without engendering massive eventual violence. You absolutely can build a shared national framework, a lingua franca for commerce and government. But when you cross the line into actively denying the very existence of a massive cultural group,
it becomes something else entirely.
when you look at millions of people and tell them their ancient language is just a corrupted dialect, when you deny them political provinces, and when you systematically exclude them from the civil service to the point of structural poverty, you aren't building unity. You are building a pressure cooker of resentment.
Which is exactly what happened.
The modern Saraiki movement, which continues to demand a separate province today, isn't trying to invent some brand new fabricated grievance out of thin air to destabilize the state.
They just want what was taken from them.
They are simply trying to win back the exact same recognition that the Linguistic Survey of India had empirically granted them over a century ago. They are fighting a desperate rearguard action to reclaim a distinctiveness that was scientifically proven and then administratively erased.
This has been an incredibly dense, rewarding, and frankly sobering journey through the mechanics of history. Let's try to pull all of these complex threads together into a unified understanding.
Let's do it.
When we place the Pashtun story and the Saraiki story side by side, we see that they both share the exact same structural origin point.
They both begin with the trauma of the Sikh conquest of the early 19th century, the sudden, violent reversal of power flowing from east to west, followed immediately by the British Empire arriving, inheriting those exact same extractive provincial boundaries and locking them into place with military garrisons.
But from that identical starting point, they diverge entirely in their outcomes based on how the empire categorized them.
Completely different trajectories.
For the Pashtuns, the combination of conquest and the bizarre aesthetic racial ethnography, the travel writers obsessing over skin color and categorizing shepherds as Irish haymakers, produced a deeply antagonistic racialized charge attached to the word Punjabi. The colonial state weaponized their identity for military recruitment, turning a regional neighbor into a militarized, occupying rival.
While for the Saraikis, the exact same structural process of conquest led to an administrative eclipse.
A silent erasure.
They were subjected to an absorption that lacked the violent racialized antagonism but carried devastating, slow-moving socioeconomic consequences. Their distinctiveness was proven by colonial science, only to be actively dismantled by post-colonial nation-building, leaving them in a perpetual fight for the most basic political recognition.
And what this entire deep dive proves, and what I believe are the most vital perspective-altering takeaway from these historical documents, is that these massive, supposedly intractable divides are not timeless biological truths.
They really aren't.
They do not stem from ancient, unavoidable enmities written into the DNA of the people. They are the highly traceable, completely unintended artifacts of a very specific narrow window of history, roughly between 1802 and 1849.
It all comes back to that window.
If Mountstuart Elphinstone hadn't been so obsessed with categorizing human beings by their complexion to fit European hierarchies, if Ranjit Singh hadn't needed to relentlessly extract wealth from Multan to fund his frontier wars, and if the British colonial administrators hadn't been too lazy and cheap to redraw the provincial maps they inherited, the ethnic and political landscape of this entire region would look fundamentally different today.
History in these regions is rarely about ancient blood feuds. It is almost always about the unintended consequences of bureaucracy, taxation, and bad anthropology.
Which brings this massive historical journey right back to you, the listener, navigating the world today. We consume an endless fire hose of global news, and it is incredibly easy to fall into the trap of lazy, prepackaged narratives.
So easy.
The next time you see a headline flashing on your screen about an ancient tribal rivalry or a conflict supposedly rooted in centuries of intractable hatred, this deep dive should make you hit the pause button.
Absolutely.
It should train you to look past the surface violence and ask the real structural questions. Who actually drew the map that these people are fighting over? What biases were the people who wrote the early history carrying with them? And most importantly, who built the tax system?
Because if you follow the money and the paperwork, you will almost always find the true origin of the hatred.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering thought to mull over as we close out. We've just spent an hour proving how a traveler's passing, slightly ridiculous diary entry about a shepherd's skin color, combined with a few lines drawn by a 19th century bureaucrat trying to save time on his administrative reports, could entirely dictate the wealth, the military power, and the deeply held ethnic rivalries of millions of people 2 full centuries later.
It's a heavy thought.
So look around at the systems we interact with today. What seemingly mundane, boring administrative categories are we passively checking on census forms right now that will unwittingly create the rigid, ancient ethnic divides of the year 2226? What bureaucratic maps are we lazily drawing today that our great-great-grandchildren will kill each other over, assuming they were carved in stone by the gods?